Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. The presentation tonight is titled Where the Wild Things Grow, and I will talk about native plants and transforming your landscape using our U.S. native, preferably, and hopefully mostly Illinois natives. Oops. Most gardens, when we think about them, are very well organized, and most people want flowers all the time and everything clipped and very neatly placed. When you get the bug of the wild garden, you're entering a world that will be very frustrating in the beginning. And you will have numerous disappointments that will thwart every effort that you make in trying to establish your composition. And the material will be difficult, if not impossible, to locate at times, but it is getting better these days. And your neighbors also may have something to say about the look of your garden. So before you embark on creating a native garden, make sure, if you are in a city, that you check all the ordinances. But I'm going to try to point out a few things that you will need to keep in mind before you start doing that. First, we'll look at what we call native plants and what are the advantages in using them. What are some plants that are native to Illinois, and what their landscape what are their landscape characteristics. The historical definition of a native plant is a plant that was established in North America prior to the European settlement. But of course, we also have a political definition, and that is a plant that was established in what is now the state of Illinois prior to European settlement. But the definition that I personally prefer is the indigenous plant. Those are plants that are evolved over millennia in the same habitat. The indigenous plants community provide habitat for native fauna, songbirds, insects and butterflies, and other mammals. Basically, the plants that are native to your very specific area. Unfortunately, the glaciation of the state of Illinois took a lot of the native plants from the north and brought them back down to me, where I am in the southern part of the state, where the flora is extremely diversified. And of course, these plants have evolved down here for millennia, and they have adapted and changed from very cold areas to a more mild in comparison to a season 2, because I am a region 6. So they've adapted to this particular area. A look at the Suburban Garden. It is basically a group of plants. We buy plants and we put them and shape them in areas that we want to look attractive. We try in doing that to tie the home to its surroundings. So if we are in an urban area, it's going to tie the home to the rest of the neighborhood and give your look a certain cohesion, so that your house looks like it belongs there. And also it provides for all of us gardeners an outlet for artistic expression. But the Suburban Garden is also a microcosm of nature. We try to recreate in those gardens nature as we see it, but often it is well ordered, it is controlled, and it is organized. And pretty much in an urban area we have to do that. It's a man-made garden, but it certainly can perform the same essential biological role fulfilled by healthy plant communities everywhere. And it's a chance for us to recreate nature. So if you are in an urban area and you want to start using native plants, what you're trying to do is bring in more insects and hopefully more birds and other native fauna in your backyard. And that's where it can be tricky at times. The Suburban Garden can also be a natural beauty. And of course, after a hard day at work, if you have a very pleasantly landscaped backyard, it is a refuge from a hectic and very unpleasant world, especially after driving for several hours in traffic. And generally, those type of gardens always have a theme, and they can become a source for natural beauty. Your theme could be a sun garden, it could be a Mediterranean style garden, it could be a well-clipped edged garden that mimics the French style garden. It could have a lot of tropical looking plants, so you feel like you are in the tropics. But anyway, you create your own theme and your own refuge in your own backyard. Comparing the urban garden versus the natural environment, we do find some basic differences that will affect your choice of plants and how those plants, even though they are native, will perform in your particular area. The urban environment is always warmer because we have a lot more impermeable surfaces that reflect a lot of heat. The wind velocity is reduced or changed, and a lot of soil compaction because we have a lot of traffic. And of course, we have a very much higher level of pollutant within a particular area. The air sometimes can feel like it is stagnating and not moving at all. And the main style of garden in urban areas is the turf, and that is the majority of the yards. Looking at an urban garden like this one, there is a colonnade there that will take your eyes and stop it and keep you from looking at the street beyond. And so it becomes a place for you to rest your eyes and pay attention a little bit more to the plants rather than going directly to the traffic. Why should we use indigenous plants? They do provide a beautiful space. They are very hardy. They're very drought resistant, and for most of them, they are very low maintenance. But some of them can be very invasive, and at that point, they are garden thugs, and we have to decide whether or not we want to deal with them and spend a lot of time removing them or not use them at all. They do benefit the environment because basically they are the first trophic level. All insects, herbivore insects and herbivore mammals will come to them to eat. And of course, fungi, omicides, bacteria, all of these other creatures that we don't think about also love the plants, and that's what they use to feed on. I would say that every creature depends on them, and we of course depend on them as well, because when we eat the cows or the chickens, those have also been fed plant material, and without that, those would not exist. But the most important thing is that the plants are the only creature on Earth that are capable of transforming and capturing the sun's energy and turn that into food for the rest of us. In that way, the plants are very unique and they are extremely important. And once they are established in your area, if you use a native plant and it really likes its environment, it will save you time and money because it will multiply itself without any help from you, and it does not require as much watering and no need for fertilizer. They do thrive on mostly poor soil. Generally, pesticides are not required, and no more watering and lawn maintenance equipment. That is, if you get rid of your lawn and replace that with a native garden. We do not need any fertilizers because the plant debris that you leave on the garden eventually break down into their elements and provide slow release fertilizers for the plants that are that are there. Definitely when you use indigenous or native plants, whichever way you want to look at them, you do not want to use any pesticides. And remember that when you put them there, you're also attracting the fauna. So if you don't want to feed the insects and the birds, then native plants are not for you, because once you put those plants in your yard, you are going to have to accept a certain level of predation, because that's what they're there for, and that's why the insects and birds are coming to your area. Definitely less water than lawn. These are statistics that I got from the East Coast. Actually, it was from the National Center for Sustainable Landscaping. 30% of water consumption in the East Coast goes to the lawn. 60% of water consumption on the West Coast also to the lawn. And this morning on NPR, there were some new restrictions in California reducing the water consumption by even a greater amount and eliminating the use of lawns in any new public constructions. Also, by not having the lawn, you help also to reduce the pollution. There is no mowing required, and the native plants are very good at sequestering the carbon from the air, so less carbon dioxide is being released. The plant that is showing on the image is Mazus reptans. Unfortunately, it is not a native plant to Illinois. At least I have not found any reference to it in the books. It's possible that it is there. But I have seen a lawn made with that, and it is absolutely gorgeous. It's very low. You don't have to water it. And the most beautiful thing is that in spring, it is a purple carpet. So this is something, if you have access to ever find it and you do want to replace your lawn with extremely low maintenance, this would be a plant to consider. This is illustrating some of how the runoffs affect forested watersheds and urban watershed. The urban watershed has compacted soil and very large areas of impervious surfaces, concrete roads, paved surfaces, minimal amount of exposed soil. So when we have a large storm, it just runs off and takes away, and it's done in a very short period of time. And the same thing for a small storm, the same kind of thing. The water leaves the area very, very quickly. Whereas an urban watershed, the water coming down is spread by the canopy of the trees. It's not a direct hit onto the soil. It hits the canopy, and so the water gets diffused. And when it gets on the ground, since there are no impervious surfaces, the water simply percolates through the soil and eventually gets down into the watershed, and then you have your water reserves. And the disturbance to the topsoil is very, very minimal, because most forested areas will have some duff on the soil surface. The next slide shows illustrations of prairie plants that were under investigations, and the researchers were looking at the length, the depth at which some plants would go to find water. Unfortunately, this is not a clear picture, and each one of these plants is identified. But looking at a depth of 10 feet and comparing that to the root system of turf grass, we can see the difference between native prairie plants and turf grass, and why turf grass requires so much water in order to survive. The prairie plants dig down very, very far to find water sources. Just think of plants like the mesquite that survive in the deserts in Arizona or Nevada, and those plants are nice and green and they're flourishing, and you have to wonder how deep are the root system to those plants. They do find water somehow. This slide shows Spring Beauty. It's a little flower, about a half an inch at the most, but with the camera you can really see a lot more in the flower. So what are the advantages of using the native plants? Number one, they're adapted to the local soil and climate. So if you have a heavy clay soil like we tend to have in the southern region, the plants have evolved. They have found ways to develop their root system so they can survive. And if you are in the middle of the state where you have those very deep, rich soils, your plants have evolved there and they do fine. If I were to transplant them in the southern region where I have a lot of clay, then they would not do so well. The pests and also the diseases, they are accustomed to that and they will take the predation, and if they are a perennial plant or an annual, they will put out a second set of foliage and go on. But little plants like this is what we call the spring ephemeral. It only comes up in the spring, it blooms, forms the seeds, and then goes back into dormancy in about 2 or 3 months. So to see Spring Beauty, you really have to get out there and see them. As I said before, all animals depend on the plants, and they have very high value for wildlife. And depending on where you are, there are certain plants that will only grow in certain regions. And so by seeing certain types of vegetation, we can say, oh, this is a desert because only this type of plant will grow, or we are under a forest canopy, so we are under shade, so these types of plants will grow. So that's one of the ways of identifying native plants that are very specific to very specific regions. The animals are, some of the animals that depend on wildlife are not very important in transferring the energy from plants, but others, like insects, are extremely important in transferring that energy from the plant to the next trophic level. So think of all the insects that are devouring our plants, and all of these insects are food for the birds. And so they are taking the energy created by the plants and then transferring it onto the next level, and eventually it all gets to us human, and we benefit from that. In a native landscaping, you also need to think of diversity. So plant as many different types of plants as you can in your area to promote that biodiversity, because lots of insects, birds feed on very specific plants, and others do not. They're more general. Things like the monarch butterfly, we all are doing something about preserving monarch habitat, but it's not just the monarch that feed on milkweed. You have the milkweed beetle, you have the milkweed tussock moth. I mean, there are at least a half a dozen insects that depend on the milkweed. So try to incorporate as many other plants like dugbeans or New Jersey tea or goat's beard that promote other insects. And if the plants enjoy your area, then they will save you money, because you're not going to have to go back out to the nurseries and keep buying plants to replenish the ones that have died. You're also saving money by not having to water those plants. And with their ability to sequester a lot of carbon, these plants will help reduce the pollution in your immediate area as well. Just like in any other type of landscaping, we have to consider certain aspects, even though those plants are adapted to their environment. So the key is to give them the environment that they evolved in. So consider light. Is it a full sun plant, or is it a shade or a semi-shade? Soil type. Is it a heavy clay? Is it a very sandy soil, like around the lakes? Something that is very deep, like in the middle of the state. The hardiness zone, if you want to grow the zone 6 and 7 plants, then if you are in a zone 3 or 4, you may have to do that indoors and bring them in as house plants, because they are not going to survive in your area. And a lot of our native plants have evolved also with other plant species, and so don't just do a monoculture, just try to bring in other plant species that have gone with them. Sun exposure, is it on the north side of the slope, on the south side of the slope, how many hours, and how hot is that sun? Moisture, some of them do require moisture if they are used to being in a marsh. If they are marsh plants, then you do have to have more moisture for them. Bog plants, they do require a lot more moisture. Salinity, if we are close to the roads or close to the ocean, and wherever there is a high level of salt in their natural habitat, that's something that you'll also have to take into consideration. And some plants are very sensitive to some pollutants, so that's where when I said at the beginning you will have some disappointment. That's where often we lose a lot of the native plants that are not used to high pollutants that we can find in cities. In a natural environment, because of this diversity, the whole look is much more forgiving, because if one plant dies, there are thousands of seeds left in the seed bank in the ground for it to reproduce itself. And if we have a big drought and the area dries out, well, the plant knows enough to just shut itself down and stop reproducing and go dormant for the rest of the season. And next year it will come back up. And so that's something that as a landscaper or as a gardener, you need to keep that in mind, because your environment is not always going to be so well organized or as organized as you want it to be. It's going to be a lot more relaxed. So if you're ready to deal with that, then this type of gardening is very easy on the nerves, because you learn to accept a lot more faults and admire the beauty of the plants themselves. This is a forested area in southern Illinois in winter, so it looks like more or less a monoculture, but this is a swamp area, and so these are cypresses that are in the fall, and we do have some snow cover in there already, and so, but we do have an understory, and that's where you get the diversity, and most of the time that's what you have in a forest. You'll have some very tall trees, and then the understory will be extremely diverse. The wild larkspur that is coming up will last for a few months, and then after that other native plants will come up and take its place. And so you will have often this type of look where we'll have succession blooms from different plants. And a month after this picture was taken, it was a completely different look. So that's something that you can also try to incorporate in your design. What we try to do in an urban area, we try to mimic the natural environment. So but by doing that, we have to take drastic measures. We have to prune, to shape, to control the size. And another thing that most gardeners do is try to eliminate diseases, insects, damage, and all that. Damage, you do need to take care of it, because if you leave a wounded plant open and you don't help it to seal itself, you have an open wound that will be affected by fungi and bacteria. And some people do not tolerate messy droppings. Well, if you're going towards the more natural area, you're going to have to accept the messy droppings, because those droppings of fruits and from the plants, that's what a lot of insects and other animals feed on. And so there is a trade-off there. In this particular picture, I know that the plant in the front, the yellow one, was a St. John's wort, which is native to Illinois, but the red plant is Crocosmia cultivar called Lucifer, and on the side there is some yellow yarrow that is just coming in. So to design a native landscape, especially in an urban area, if there is a special plant that you like, don't feel that you cannot incorporate it. I encourage you to incorporate as many of the plants that you love with our native plants, and you will find the proper balance for you. And that's what's important, because that's what's going to make you enjoy your garden. Don't feel like if you're going to do native, you can only do natives. If you have 10, 15, 20 acres, it's a whole lot less expensive to do only the natives and just let them have the run of the place. But in an urban area, it still has to be controlled somewhat. So whatever you choose, use good judgment. And first of all, always check the endangered species list. And so if a plant is endangered and you find it for sale, just buy it and try to get it to multiply in your yard. And so you will add more numbers to it so that it's no longer on the invasive list. And also check the invasive list, because certain plants like the Bradford pears, even though it is not officially on the list, but there is certainly a movement to try to minimize using this particular tree in the landscape, because it has spread into very sensitive natural areas, and it is overtaking those areas and shading some of our more sensitive plants. So be cognizant of that. What you also might consider doing is choose a plan that will fit your environment and your space. Nature somehow finds the way to locate a specimen very carefully, and if the plant doesn't like one spot, it just keeps reseeding itself until one plant does much better than the rest, and then all of a sudden when we see it, it is absolutely spectacular. And so that's what, as gardeners, especially in urban areas, that's what we'll try to do. If you have rolling hills, or if you're at the forest edge or near a riverbank, think of tall prairie grasses in some areas, or salt marshes of coastal areas. Just look around you and see what would fit your area the best. Giant delphiniums, you might be in love with these giant delphiniums, and if it's something that you want to have in your yard, then by all means have those. This is a hybrid. It's not the original native plant, but it is a spectacular plant, and they do get to be about 5 to 6 feet tall in the northeastern, where you have longer summers, so more the daylight is much longer, so these plants do grow a lot taller than they would in my region, for example. In this combination, we have columbines, hostas, some wild violets, but what's bringing this together and giving it that little punch of color is the Japanese painted fern that is in there. So again, it doesn't have to be all native plants. We do have some very pretty ferns as well. There is the great fern, which has these type of mauve, deep burgundy type color, but it is it doesn't have the silver edge of this particular fern. It would bring some color, but not like this one does. So don't feel like you have to stick to just the absolute native plants. Solidago rugosa fireworks. Behind it is a miscanthus, and this is a goldenrod. It's not as aggressive as a very large one. This is a smaller cultivar, but in the fall it is absolutely spectacular. So if you're looking for something yellow for your yard in the fall, this is it. It is just very, very nice. So what do we need to do to create a great natural garden, not have too many disappointments when we do? So you need to think of the space as a whole and organize your composition and take into consideration the areas that you need for your barbecue, for the deck, and if you have children and grandchildren, what areas are going to be the play areas, the utility area for your trash or compost pile, whatever you have. So you need to look at the whole area and start placing your native plants that fit your vision of your landscape, and try to put them in low traffic zone. You're just like any other plant. You're creating your flower borders. You certainly do not want everybody playing football on your flowers. So design your area, your garden in the same way that you do with the other plants, and match your landscape and the characteristics of your plants. If it's a woody plant, then put it somewhere where it's going to keep its form and be able to develop. And if it's a shade-tolerant plant, don't try to grow it in an area where it's going to get 8 to 10 hours of full sun every day. On a contemporary space, on a contemporary garden, the emphasis is often on the space that is created by the plants, whereas in a natural and wild garden, it's the plants themselves that you are emphasizing and not the space that they create. So it's kind of opposite to what most of us grew up seeing and also probably doing for several years, and so you have to start changing, really a drastic way of changing your thinking when you start trying to create a natural garden that is beautiful and relaxed and takes your eyes, and you can look at the landscape and never really get tired of it. And in order to do that, I will really encourage you to go out into natural areas and observe the natural environment and get a lot of ideas from that. And by creating these gardens, you're also going to be supporting the local fauna. So that's very important. So you're going to have a lot of predation, and what you're doing is also help reduce the habitat fragmentation that exists right now, because a lot of our birds have to travel miles and miles before they can stop and replenish their supplies when they are doing their migration. And that's the story with the monarch butterfly as well, you know. So if we can create these little pockets when they can stop, that really will help the fauna. Look around you. This is a parking lot, and instead of grass and other things, they had also a combination of native plants and annuals, and it was just lovely. This was in Boulder, Colorado, and so rocks and granite type rocks are very prominent. So these were part of the landscaped area. It wasn't huge, but it was very pleasing when you would walk up into the parking lot, going to your car and going to the stores as well. So what you want to do is mimic nature, but it's not possible to really copy nature 100%. We might do that with a photograph, and that's about it. Try to also think of where these plants grow normally. So that's where going out into natural areas, you can really observe those plants and see where they are. And by using these plants, you're really reducing your maintenance, but not the first 3 or 4 years, because that's when you're going to be fighting all of the grass and all of the undesirable weeds, which are, by the way, plants out of place that you don't want there. And so, but eventually, once you get there, it's really a low maintenance garden. If you choose to use herbicides to establish your garden, use the low toxicity as you can, and non-persistent herbicides such as a straight glyphosate. There are some combinations that I have seen that also will prevent seed germinations. And if you're trying to seed with native grasses, well, that chemical does not know whether or not it is a weed seed or a seed that you want. It's simply going to abort the germination. So make sure that you use just a straight glyphosate. And you may have to do these applications several times during the first year to really gain control over the existing vegetation. And as with any pesticide that you use, please read the label and follow the manufacturer's instructions very, very carefully. Then the question becomes whether or not you should seed the area, broadcast the seeds, or use transplant. Seeds are definitely less expensive, but the germination rate could be a whole lot lower than what you are used to, and so it might take a while for the plants to start coming up. But all these plants grow very, very slowly, because the first few years they are spent simply on growing very long, extensive root system that will guarantee their survival. So once they germinate, the first part of the plant that comes up, it's going to be about 6 to 8 inches for about a year or two, and then the plant will go to full size, and that's when you will get your blooms. Most of those plants do that. The one that I can think of will give you instant satisfaction would be a coreopsis, and the coreopsis will come up that first year and bloom, and actually bloom twice, because mine is getting ready to rebloom. So if you're using seeds, don't be discouraged, because they do take the germination rate, as I mentioned, on some plants is between 25 and 30% that first year, and then gradually the seeds will mature, and then you'll be able to see more and more of your plants. But don't get discouraged, just keep trying. A new word that is currently in use in the industry is the word nativar, and it is a word that was coined by Dr. Alan Armitage. He's a professor of horticulture at Georgia Tech. And the way he explained it is that most of those nativar, which are native cultivars, like the word cultivars, that is coined from cultivated varieties, and so we'll shorten it to cultivars, and so this is nativars. Most of them happen really in cultivation in the nurseries. Sometimes it will be a chance crossing that is discovered by an employee, or it could be a very specific cross between two genotypes, like a yellow echinacea and a red echinacea, or yellow and a white, and then you get different colors, and that was done purposely. One instance that I know is of the penstemon, the Husker Red. When it came out 20 or so years ago, everybody was just crazy, had to have it, but then the plant gradually through the season lost its red burgundy pigment, and there is a cultivar that was introduced about 3 years ago still a penstemon that apparently holds that color for a much longer period of time, and it just happened to have been discovered by an employee at a nursery. They saw it, they thought, oh my gosh, what is that? They picked it up and then started observing it and realized that it kept its color all year round. So the nursery eventually released it as a new cultivar and with the name and everything else. And sometimes these nativars could be a plant that you see in a farmer's field that looks very different from what you're accustomed to seeing. I have stopped on the side of the road to look at big blue stems simply because those plants were so blue. I had never seen a big blue stem that blue, so I had to get out of the car and go take a look to make sure that I was actually seeing what I was seeing. And I do know plant hybridizer actually did that. He did find a little blue stem that had more of a reddish tinge to it, and so he got that plant and worked on it, and a few years later he introduced it as a new hybrid. So we do have also natural hybrids. Mother Nature will provide, the means for the plants to hybridize themselves, and sometimes they can be very attractive. They will have beautiful colors, but just like a lot of hybrids, sometimes they will lose pollen. They won't be quite as efficient, and so the native fauna is no longer attracted to them. I have a yarrow in my yard that starts out kind of a red, then fades to a pink, and then eventually to a white. This is the first year that it bloomed, and I have yet to see a single insect on that plant. Well, I can tell you right now, it is the last year that it will be there, but I'll just have to find something else to replace it, or maybe put it somewhere else where I don't have to look at it quite so much. But those things do happen. So even the hybrids, the native hybrids, are not always beneficial to the insects and the birds. Also keep in mind the size of the plant, how tall, how wide the plant is going to be, and the growth habit. Is it spreading? Is it upright? Is it round? Is it ball shaped? Keep in mind all these things. And the labels on all the plants that are sold are usually very good at describing the growth habits of the plant, and the plant USDA plants that NRCS maintains also has pages upon pages of description of the plants, and so that's another place you can go and look at also. Moisture requirements, you can, if the company that is producing the plants should be able to tell you whether or not it is a plant that requires a little bit more moisture, or whether or not it really enjoys more drier sites. Flowering period, I know we all like to look at flowers, and so create for yourself a flowering chart. Know when you want to have the flowers, and then buy the plants that will fit within that time period. All plants will produce some type of fruit that is beneficial to the insects and the birds, and so keep that in mind. Toxicity, if you have children running around the yard, certainly you do not want to be planting toxic plants where they would easily have access to them. And foliage color instead of a flower might be very important for you. And also, what would be the best companions? There are, I believe it's in Missouri, when they first started the Grow Native, there are pages of reference material that you can access, and they do have recommendations of best companions for their native plants. And we do have a lot of the same flora as Missouri, so you could get some ideas from that. And by all means, make it sustainable. The proper soil preparation is perhaps the most important factor for success. You need to remove existing lawn, then remove this with a sod cutter. Don't try to kill it and then till it. Don't try to do that, because if you turn over the soil, you're going to be exposing a seed bank, and then you're going to have to start killing all of that. So try to remove the sod with all the seeds and everything else, and then go from there. All of your seeds that you expose are also going to compete with the seedlings that you are going to put in. They're going to take a lot of more nutrients and water, and generally annuals will grow very fast and will shade your native plants, will chop perennials, and so you will not have a good success rate on doing that. So if we go from a lawn area, start very small, take one little section at a time, and start transforming it. It could be just with trees and a combination of annuals and perennials, and there you have a lot of different colors and textures, and so you don't have to do the whole thing all at once. Just start very small, one little bit at a time. Maintenance. Your transplants are going to grow faster, because when you buy your transplant, they'll be about 2 years old. And so when you put them in the ground, you'll only have 1 year to wait, maybe 2 at the most. And some of them may bloom the first year. So to keep your costs down, buy very small plants, and if you have to buy from nurseries that are not in your area, certainly the smaller plants are going to be a whole lot less expensive on freight. And when you put your plants in the ground, put something next to them, or you can use the plant tag so you know what they later on, as if you're battling weed seeds, that this way you will know what your native plants are. And if you have to use mulch, use a weed-free material such as clean straw or wood chips, very fine ground wood chips. And about 3 inches, no more than that. It's really not necessary to choke the plants. I prefer to cut rather than pull the weeds. I will often do that, and I have a little spray bottle that I mix in glyphosate, and so whatever is left, I spray that and kill it. So I'm not disturbing the soil, and I'm not encouraging the weed growth, and also I'm not damaging the roots on my young plants. In some areas, burn is the best way to clear away the old vegetation, and also stimulates new growths, and the nutrients from the ash will also nourish the soil, but not in a home landscape. We can't really do that, and even in some more rural areas, in the larger cities down here, burning is illegal within the city limit, and so you really have to pay attention to these ordinances. But cutting and removing debris from an area does exactly the same thing as a natural fire cycle, because you're exposing the soil to the warmth of the sun, and if there are any native plants there, then that will encourage them to start growing. Now, to encourage growth, cutting done in the spring or in the fall, depending on which area you're in, and sometimes on trees you may have to skip a few seasons in order to get the shape that you want, and each technique will favor different plants and encourage diverse plant growth. And so if you have to do cutting, know exactly how you're going to do it and what you are cutting, because the plants react very definitely in their own fashion to a cut. If you are using seeds, keep the landscaped area 6 inches, cut to 6 inches the first year to control weeds, especially if you're doing native grasses. Most seeded native flowers and grasses will not grow taller than your 6 inches, so the first year. So there you'll have a chance of preserving the crown of these plants. They really remain small, so you really need to know where you're putting them if you're using the seeds. Generally, soft prairie flowers will give you that pop of color that you're looking for, instead of the very bright colors that I know I like the bright colors, but sometimes having the subtle colors but a very large mass of color will give you that satisfaction that sometimes we get from smaller planting. A lot of texture. We can some of those plants also have fiery and contrasting colors, and so plant texture, leaf colors, all that comes into play. And then think of at least 3 seasons of vegetation. In the spring when they first come up, in the summer if they are annuals or perennials that are blooming in the summer, and then in the fall when these plants start changing color, and that will give you really 3 seasons of color. And then of course in the winter we do have color. It's a different color, but it's a much more quiet color and structure of these plants. In a native garden, the planting is very informal in style, and the plants kind of lean on each other, or not lean on each other, they lean away from each other. And so that's a look that you have to get accustomed to. And plant in drifts of flowers that overlap and blend into each other, not separated as we saw in that in a few slides previous. So try to mimic nature as much as you can. Let them get into each other. This is that one of the first pictures that I had shown with different plants, and they're all kind of, they are next to each other, but when you look at it, it looks almost as if they are woven through together. The plants in this design were on a hillside, and there were some black-eyed Susan, echinaceas, and some other annuals that were in there, lots of grasses. But looking at it, it was very beautiful and buzzing to a dozen type of insects, and they paid no attention to the passersby because they were busy feeding themselves, and all of these plants were providing a very high source of nectar. For a minimum of a 10 by 10 of space, you can create a small meadow in an area, and definitely free draining and full sun. And you do have that slide that gives you, just a basic plan for a very small prairie garden. These are, the ground covers are very useful, and we certainly have tons of them in Illinois, but you don't have to stick to just the native ground covers if you don't have access to them. You can use other things as well, but if you're trying to get away from grass and ivy and cemetery vines and all of these ground covers, you do have choices. Callirrhoe is the purple poppy mallow, and it is very, very attractive. And we have Pachysandra, native Pachysandra, Sanguinaria, and Asarum, and those prefer damp shade. So this is the wild ginger, damp shade. You can see the predation in those leaves, but the carpet was just so thick and beautiful that you really don't notice all the holes. This is the Massachusetts bearberry it's very, very low growing ground cover. That's the detail for the bearberry, kinnick. This is the purple poppy mallow. It is a mallow, so it looks like any of it's a small hibiscus, but magenta in color, and it spreads like crazy, and it really can cover quite a bit of space and highly drought tolerant. low bush blueberry. If you have more of an acidic soil, that would be an option. This is a really, really small blueberry plant. Geum, which is normally considered a weed, but there are some cultivars where the flowers are much larger, but this is actually the native weeds that was being used as an edging plant in this particular landscape. The Pachysandra, the difference between this and the Japanese Pachysandra is that our Pachysandra does not have the shiny leaves that you find in the Japanese one, but it is very attractive and really works well as a ground cover on the trees. Golden seal is another one that you could use. Ground cover plants can be used to add interest and color to the spaces between a patio slab or step, and these plants are tough and they withstand some light footfall. And chamomile, thyme are not native, but really will fill in the gap as you find some of the replacement. But sedums, we do have several sedums that are native to the state, and definitely worth considering. And then Mazus reptans, which is the plant that I mentioned earlier as a replacement. And there you can see there that orange area there to the right of the screen, those are sedums. But along the steps, that's the woolly thyme that was getting ready to bloom. So you can do a combination of different things. Many spaces in the garden where mowing is difficult or even impossible can benefit by having native plants there on a bank or a steep slope. You want something that has a very fibrous root system. Small shrubs like the scented sumac are very good at helping to retain the soil, and so that's something that could be used. And since it is a woody plant, it comes back year after year, and it does reproduce very, very easily. Some ground covers would be ideal, and also would offer good coverage, but with minimal maintenance, so you don't have to be climbing up a bank and trying to mow that. So that's one way of eliminating that. Or you can use annuals or perennial, herbaceous perennial natives as well. This is along a riverbank, and in the back is, oh, my mind just drew a blank now. But these are all, this is in the northeast, and so their native plants are quite different from what we have here. But this was just along a dry creek bed, and all of these plants were native plants that were allowed to just come in very close. This is basically the house is built on top of this granite rock and had a lot of different types of ground covers that had found footholds in the crevices, and the owners just simply worked with them. Along a riverbank, by having some planting, this one is sort of is landscape. You know, the Gunera there really was the focal point, and by doing that, you keep people from stepping on the edge of the of a pond or something like that. And you can also create that same look in a backyard by creating a pond, a reflecting pond or reflecting pool that would give you that same kind of a look. So it really is up to you what you do. Under the trees, as we know, lawn grasses struggle and do not do very well. So instead of trying to establish a lawn, find some attractive shade-loving ground covers and other plants and shrubs that will do very well on there. Sedge, that burr sedge was along the creek bed there. Ferns are very good, and we have a lot of native ferns in the state, and so try to find them and use them, and they will really be satisfying. This is a combination of fern and a clematis and hydrangea, and it was just enough light coming in for the clematis to be very happy where it was and getting just the right amount of sunlight. Mahonia and ferns, this is definitely more of a shade or partial shade combination. Another type of sedge that you can consider using would be the Pennsylvania sedge. It's a very long sedge that it willfully lays down, but it looks like cascading waves of green. It's a very different look, and as I said, it's something that you have to get used to. But there, it was right next to a path, and it was very attractive at the edge of a forested area. Also take into consideration other trees and shrubs, evergreens, and please consider not planting Bradford pears. Choose the ones that are best for your area. Plant in a community, so varieties that support your local wildlife. So keep that in mind, and try to avoid monoculture at all costs. Forested area with pines and under canopy trees. This is more or less a monoculture, but this was done to create a statement. The owners wanted to have a separation between the upper part of the yard and the lower part of the yard, and really block the view. So you had to go either right or left around this hedge of arborvitae and view some different things. But right below that, they had a variety of plants along that ledge. Dogwoods supports a whole slew of wildlife, but it's one of these trees that when it's really under the canopy, it is small, but you put it at the edge and then it becomes spectacular because it has more room to grow. The smoke tree, this is the flower from that, so it's up to you whether or not you want to grow it for the color or you want to grow it and have the smoke as well. And so the maintenance on that will vary depending on what you want to do with the plant. Bottlebrush buckeye, this was just a very low edge to separate one part of the garden to the next, and it worked beautifully. It's maybe 5-6 feet high, but when the buckeye was blooming, it was just spectacular. The Physocarpus, the 9-bark, sometimes when you buy in bundles from the conservation department, you'll get some cultivars that will be one particular color, and like this one had more of a coppery tone to the leaves, but the flower buds, this is actually after flowering, these are the seed heads, was quite spectacular. And then we have this one that everybody loves, which is Diablo, which is a cultivar, well, a nativar, but what most people have found is that there is no predation on this particular 9-bark. There is a whole lot more on the other ones, but and this, I guess, because of the high level of anthocyanin in the leaves, that's why the insects are not biting on this one. But the purple in the landscape is very, very pretty, very attractive when it's placed properly. Scented sumac is the fruits are very attractive, very interesting in the fall, and the plant does have a smell. The leaves, you can crush them and smell them, and this one is more or less well, kind of a semi-shade, but will tolerate full sun at times. The next slides, I'm just going to show you some plants that you can consider for your spring garden. Celandine poppy, that's a woodland plant. The trillium, again, that's woodland. This is the purple trillium. Camastia, or the wild hyacinth. Sometimes you can find it easily, and other times you really have to look for that. Hypericum, St. John's wort, quite readily available in a lot of nurseries. Black-eyed Susan, we all know this one. Lobelia cardinalis, and that is a wet area, so if you have a bog garden anywhere that's going to be wet, that's a good plant to have. Our native honeysuckle, So if you want to have honeysuckle. Late spring and summer bloomers, Monarda fistulosa, this is our native bee balm. It's kind of a lavender, pale lavender color. Prairie drop seed is very interesting. It's like a little fountain, and then the bloom spikes are quite tall. They'll get to about 2.5 feet, and it's very, very pretty in the fall with different colors from tan to bronze. Of course, the milkweed. This is a common milkweed, but I like the geometry of the milkweed seeds in the pot. I just could not resist the picture. Echinacea, this is the purple cone flower. This plant is very interesting. It's in the sunflower family, but the two leaves are fused, and so they form a cup. So in the summer, whatever shower happens, the plant holds water, and so a lot of insects will go there to drink. So it's a very useful plant to add. It will get to about 10 feet and blooms around August. It's very, very attractive. Goat's beard around July, August. The flowers are loved by little insects. It's always teeming. If you don't have it and you want something white and spectacular in July, this is the plant to do it. Fall bloomers and color. The boneset can be a thug, so be careful. Don't be afraid to start pulling it as long as you can. Identify the plant and just keep it confined. But it is very, very pretty in the fall when it blooms, and highly prized by insects. Of course, little blue stem. Goldenrod, this is one of the natives and one of the more invasive ones, and so you'll really have to pull the goldenrod out very early on in the spring, because if you let it get a foothold, then you're really going to have a fight on your hand trying to pull it out. Combination of the giant cane in the back and the prairie drop seed in the front, and fall combination. American beautyberry. This is a very, very pretty and kind of front of the border, shrub border plant, because it is really insignificant all summer, and then in the fall you get these magenta looking berries, and it is definitely a showstopper when it's fruiting. And of course, winterberry holly. You might be lucky to have this plant with all the berries for several months after the fall, but the birds do love it, and once they run out of food, they will take everything off. So if you're considering winterberry holly, make sure that you have two. One male plant and one female plant, and it takes I believe the ratio is 1 male plant for 10 female plants, so you could have as many as 10 in there. The shrub itself is not very spectacular, but when well placed and with other plants around it, and you wait for this display in the winter, then you will have something very, very special. This is my last slides. This is my contact information. And I'd like to leave you with this quote from Lady Bird Johnson. Wherever I go in America, I like it when the land speaks its own language in its own regional accent. I have been fortunate enough to have visited the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin. And driving down, I was going down to Texas in January, and the bluebonnets were blooming in the median, and I literally stopped the car to see what was going on. It was mind-boggling to see so many native plants. Was the bluebonnets and the Indian paintbrush. It was absolutely spectacular. And so Lady Bird Johnson was very instrumental in promoting the use of native plants. And she started out with her home state of Texas, and then gradually it expanded to some other some of the states. But whatever you do, I will really tell you to do not collect wild plants from nature preserves. People have worked very hard in getting them there and accounting for them. So please do not take the plants out of the nature preserves. And if there are seed pods, let them go. Do not take them out of there. If you are interested in using native plants and finding out more about them, contact an Illinois Native Plant Society in your area or wild ones. I know they are nationwide. The Audubon Society or any organization that raises funds with sales of native plants. A lot of them will be very knowledgeable about the use of the plants and what type of wildlife that they support. And there are several nurseries in Illinois and Missouri that specialize in native plants, so at least now we do have access to these plants, and I'm seeing more and more nurseries carrying more native plants. So this is all I have for you this evening, and I will keep the mic open for questions. Do native plants differ significantly in northern Illinois from northern Wisconsin? Well, yes, unfortunately. They are not hugely different, but there are plants that you have in your part of Wisconsin that we do not have in northern Illinois, and vice versa, and because we're just a zone lower than northern Wisconsin. Unless you are right next to the lake, and that's a whole different area, and so that would be very different again. And if anybody wants to use the mic, please unmute the mic and you can ask the question. Any more questions? You're welcome.